For much of the 20th century, the international image of Canada was one of peace, diplomacy, and quiet reserve. To the world, Canadians were the reliable, soft-spoken allies, but to the soldiers of the German Wehrmacht and the Imperial German Army, the maple leaf meant something very different. It did not represent politeness. It represented the stormtroopers of the North, a force that, once provoked, displayed a cold, methodical violence that few other nations could match. The Canadians were not professional soldiers by trade. In 1914, and again in 1939, they were a civilian army. They were loggers from the Rockies, farmers from the endless prairies, hunters from the northern woods, and miners from the Canadian Shield. They carried a frontier mentality straight into the mechanized slaughter of the world wars. And really, that mentality was defined by two things: extreme patience, then absolute, uncompromising force. So throughout history, there were specific moments when Canadian troops decided that the rules of warfare had been forfeited by the enemy. And when that line was crossed, the Canadian response was not just a military maneuver. It became an act of total eradication. The first time the world truly saw the Canadians reach their breaking point came in April 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres. Up until that point, the Canadians were still seen as green, untested, and unproven. But that changed in a single afternoon when the German army unleashed a horrifying new weapon: 160 tons of chlorine gas. As the yellow-green cloud drifted toward the Allied lines, the French colonial troops on the Canadian flank collapsed in panic. Men choked, men died. The chemical burned their lungs from the inside out. But the Canadians did not run. They had no gas masks. They had no proper protection. So they followed the desperate advice of a chemist in their ranks. They urinated on their handkerchiefs and pressed the ammonia-soaked cloth against their faces. And in that moment, in the middle of that poison and terror, something inside the Canadian psyche snapped. They did not merely hold the line, they launched counterattacks through the gas itself. British observers described those attacks as suicidal. The Canadians fought with bayonets, with clubbed rifles, with their bare hands. They watched their brothers choking to death and decided that if they were going down, they would drag the entire German line down with them. From that day forward, Canadian troops built a reputation for trench raiding that bordered on the psychotic. While other Allied units sometimes drifted into live and let live truces during the quiet hours of the night, the Canadians chose something else. They crossed no man's land in silence. They did not fire warning shots. They did not announce themselves. They slipped into German trenches with combat knives and trench clubs, cleared every occupant they found, and then vanished back into the darkness before dawn. By 1918, the German High Command had officially classified the Canadian Corps as the most dangerous elite shock troops on the Western Front. That was not an empty title. That was a warning. When the Canadians appeared on a section of the map, the Germans understood what it meant. An offensive was coming, and it would not be gentle. Then came the Second World War. The Canadians arrived in Europe with that same quiet resolve, but now the stakes were even higher because of the sheer brutality of the Nazi regime. In June 1944, shortly after the D-Day landings, the 12th SS Panzer Division, a formation made up of fanatical Hitler youth, committed a crime that changed the war for the Canadians forever. At the Ardennes Abbey near Caen, 20 Canadian prisoners of war were taken into a garden and executed with shots to the back of the head. When word of that massacre reached the frontline units of the 3rd Canadian Division, something changed. The polite Canadian soldier died there. For the men of the North, enough was enough. The war in Normandy stopped being only about liberation. It became a blood feud, and that shift mattered. It mattered deeply, because from that point on, Canadian troops were known for being especially unforgiving toward the SS. There were reports of Canadian units refusing to take prisoners for weeks at a time during the savage fighting at Caen and Verrières Ridge. If an SS officer tried to surrender only after his ammunition was gone, he often discovered that the Canadians were no longer interested in the Geneva Convention. They had reached a conclusion that was as cold as it was brutal. An enemy that murders prisoners has forfeited the right to the protection of the law. This was not panic. It was not chaos. It was not some sudden collapse of discipline. But really, that is what made it so terrifying. It was a deliberate choice, a calculated one. The Canadians became a ghost in the woods of Normandy, moving with a ferocity that shocked even their British and American allies. Quiet men, controlled men. But once that internal line had been crossed, they turned into something the Germans no longer recognized as merely another Allied force. They became an enemy that would not forget, would not forgive, and would not stop until the debt had been paid in full. That enough is enough mentality reached its peak in late 1944 during the Battle of the Scheldt. While much of the world's attention was fixed on Patton's race across France and Montgomery's failed gamble at Market Garden, the Canadians were handed the most miserable assignment in Europe. They were ordered to clear the flooded, muddy islands of the Netherlands and open the port of Antwerp. The conditions were apocalyptic. The Germans had blown the dikes, drowning the land in freezing seawater. The Canadians were forced to fight along narrow, exposed causeways with no cover at all, while under constant fire from a fanatical German defense that had been ordered by Hitler to hold at all costs. They were exhausted. They were undersupplied. They were dying in the thousands in a landscape that looked less like Europe and more like the surface of the moon. And this was where the Canadian breaking point revealed itself not as rage, not as chaos, but as grim industrial efficiency. They stopped asking for surrender. They began using total fire tactics. If a sniper fired from a farmhouse, the Canadians did not send in a squad to clear it room by room. They leveled the entire structure with 17-pounder tank guns and flamethrowers. They cleared the Scheldt, block by block, bunker by bunker, with a grinding, relentless pressure that shattered the spirit of the German garrison. They were tired of the war, tired of the mud, tired of the death. And they decided that the fastest road to the end was not around the enemy, but straight through him. Perhaps the most famous example of a Canadian soldier reaching that limit was the legendary Leo Major. During the liberation of the city of Zwolle, Major was sent on a reconnaissance mission with his closest friend, Willie Arsenault. But when Willie was killed by a German sniper, Leo Major did not fall back to request artillery. He did not wait for reinforcements. He did not pause and rethink the mission. He simply decided he had had enough. Armed with 2 submachine guns and pockets full of grenades, Major entered the city alone. What followed felt less like conventional warfare and more like controlled psychological destruction. He spent the entire night terrorizing the German garrison with speed, deception, and nerve. He would capture a German soldier, force him to lead the way to a bar or headquarters, then release him so he could spread the message that a massive Canadian force was storming the city. Then Major would race to another side of town, throw grenades, fire his weapon, and create the illusion of a full-scale invasion. By sunrise, the result was almost unbelievable. The German garrison, numbering in the hundreds, had fled the city in panic, convinced they were surrounded by thousands of Canadians. One man had broken their will. One man had liberated an entire city because he was done with the careful, correct way of doing things. He wanted vengeance for his friend. He wanted the war finished, and he turned that fury into a weapon. When Canadian troops reached their breaking point, they did not become disorganized. They did not become hysterical. They became surgical. That is what made them so dangerous in the final phase of the war. They moved through the Rhineland and into the heart of Germany in early 1945 with a grim, disciplined resolve. They were among the forces tasked with brutal operations like the fighting involving the Black Watch and the clearing of the Hochwald Forest, some of the bloodiest combat of the final months of the war. By then, German officers had begun to understand a hard truth. Their best chance of survival was often to retreat and surrender to the Americans or the British. Because to face the Canadians in 1945 was to face a force that had already passed through the crucible of Normandy and the Scheldt, and had little patience left for the rituals of honorable resistance. The Canadians had reached a brutal conclusion. The faster they destroyed the German military, the faster they could go home. The faster they crushed the last resistance, the sooner they could return to being the polite neighbors the world imagined them to be. And that is the contradiction at the center of their wartime legacy. On one side, they were liberators. On the other, they were the shock troops the Germans feared most when the line had been crossed. They were not loud about it. They did not need to be. Their reputation traveled ahead of them, trench by trench, ridge by ridge, forest by forest. By the last months of the war, the maple leaf no longer looked soft to German eyes. It looked like judgment coming over the horizon, quiet, cold, methodical, final. History remembers the Canadians as the great liberators of the Netherlands. They were the men who handed out chocolate and cigarettes to starving civilians. They were the soldiers welcomed with flowers, with tears, and with the gratitude of people who had endured occupation, hunger, and fear for far too long. That image is real. It matters. But the truth is, beneath that kindness stood a foundation of iron. These were the soldiers who stayed quiet until the line was crossed. And once it was crossed, they did not stop until the threat had been entirely and permanently removed. That was the real legacy of the Canadian shock troops. It was not built on swagger. It was not built on theatrics. It was built on a terrifying kind of restraint. They were dangerous not because they loved violence, but because they hated the war so deeply that, when pushed too far, they were willing to do whatever was necessary to finish it. And that is the part so many people misunderstand. The most dangerous man on the battlefield is not always the one who hungers for a fight. Often, it is the one who wants the fighting to end so badly that he is prepared to become ruthless in order to silence it forever. That was the Canadian way. They were quiet volunteers, civilian soldiers, men who came from forests, farms, mines, and frozen frontiers. Men who did not march into war chasing glory. Men who did not fight for medals. But when they were pushed beyond endurance, when gas rolled over the trenches at Ypres, when murdered prisoners were found in Normandy, when the mud and blood of the Scheldt consumed the last reserve of mercy, they became something the Third Reich learned to fear. They became the nightmare of an enemy that had mistaken politeness for weakness. And really, that is what made them unforgettable. They did not rage for spectacle. They did not kill for applause. They fought because enough was enough. They fought because the line had been crossed too many times. They fought because the fastest path back to peace was through the destruction of those who had made peace impossible. So yes, the world remembers the flowers, the tears, the liberated streets, and the grateful civilians. But behind all of that stood men forged by chlorine gas, trench raids, executions, flooded causeways, shattered forests, and endless graves. Men who had learned that kindness without strength is fragile, and that sometimes the only way to restore silence is to crush the thing that keeps screaming for more blood. That was why the Canadians left such a mark on both world wars. Not because they were loud, not because they were reckless, but because once they decided the enemy had forfeited every limit, they answered with a form of violence that was disciplined, deliberate, and absolute. They were the quiet neighbors the world admired, but on the battlefield, when pushed too far, they became the final consequence.